Hello and welcome to my book review for Methland, The Death and Life of an American Small Town by Nick Redding. This is a nonfiction book about meth usage and its effects on the larger community, specifically looking at a small town in Iowa called Olwine. Nick Redding spent 3 years visiting the town, following a prosecutor, users of meth within the town, the police department, the mayor, and a few other people, basically anyone who was willing to talk to him, to paint a portrait of what it was like living there, of what caused the meth abuse, of how the meth abuse works and who's largely affected by it, and how the town as a whole dealt with it. Olwine is a small rural community of about 8,000 people at the time this book is covering, which is around 2005 to 2008. And while he does talk specifically of Olwine in this book, it is largely indicative of the way meth has affected communities like Olwine across America. I gave this book 3 stars. There were plenty of good things about it that I enjoyed. I did learn a lot from it, but I do think overall it was kind of inherently flawed in a way that I couldn't get past. This book is described as an intimate look at one town's struggle against meth that has been overtaken by meth, that has, dozens of meth lab busts in a period of a couple months where that is the large focus of the crime. And it is kind of about that. Like, it focuses on Olwine as the town a lot, but I never felt like I got a true vibe of what meth was doing to the town. Like, we followed people over the course of 3 years. We followed meth users, the police, the town doctor, like a variety of people who were affected by meth, and we followed their lives and what their lives were like and the changes they were implementing to improve the town. But it honestly all kind of felt like individual stories. Like, I didn't get the story of the town. I didn't see Olwine as essentially the major character of this book, which was what I was really looking for, which is kind of how it built itself. It was kind of like I got these individual stories without that bigger picture, and I felt like the book was lesser for that. There was so much biography on the people in this book. I think he was the assistant prosecutor, Nathan Lean. We got a lot about his life and his personal life and his feelings towards his parents and his feeling towards his ex-girlfriend, kind of in a way that felt a little disrespectful and unnecessary to the story. Like, I do want to get to know these people. I do want to feel like I'm familiar with them by reading this book. They are characters in this book for all that they're real people in the world. I want to know them, but it felt, honestly, the way it was done, it felt unnecessary and felt way too much, and I felt like I was learning all of these intimate details that didn't really work towards the book's main goal of discussing the meth use in the town, of discussing what it has done to the town. Like, his relationship with his Jewish ex-girlfriend and his parents' feelings towards her really just didn't feel relevant, and it felt kind of disrespectful towards him to include them. Like, I'm not sure what that information added. I felt there would have been better ways to get to know him and for me to feel close to him as a person. Like, we can learn plenty of things about his life, but I didn't feel the need to know much about, a lot of the things that were mentioned, a lot of the biographical information. And to go along with that, there's an afterword in this book. This is not the first edition. This is like a year later. He kind of returned to the town after the book was published and talked to the people there about their feelings, which were largely negative. People were not pleased with the book, with its portrayal of the town, with its portrayal of the people. And he said point blank that it almost ruined his friendship with Nathan Lean, who was the assistant prosecutor. And he talked about how upset Nathan Lean was about, like, the way he was portrayed and the information in the book, and it just felt very invasive overall. Like, a lot of people were saying, like, it wasn't necessarily that things weren't true, it was the way he was writing about things, and it wasn't necessarily that he painted the town in a bad light, because he didn't so much. It just felt invasive, the information that he shared and the way he shared it. And I kind of felt that reading it. It felt like just kind of an invasive book in just the information overall. Like, there was a lot he could have done with this. Like, I read Dope Sick last year by Beth Macy, and that book had kind of very similar vibes to this, where she's talking about how drug addiction has affected small rural communities. And that book didn't feel invasive in the way it was talking about people. Like, Redding sent a copy of this book to Nathan Lean before it was published and gave him veto power over it, to be like, hey, like, is there anything you don't want me to include? Is there anything that's too much? And despite that, it still almost completely ruined their friendship. Like, he discusses that. Those were his words. And it's like, it just gave me an uncomfortable vibe. Like, it didn't feel necessary. It didn't feel helpful. It didn't feel like it added to the larger story about meth use in this town and how meth has affected this town. And it felt like we were getting a lot of this awkward personal information instead of learning about how meth has affected this town. For me, it just kind of missed its main objective of, like, the purpose of this book, what was wonderful about this book, what would have worked about this book didn't. It was so lacking in that regard, and everything else, there was a lot of filler. In addition, there was also a lot about the history of meth, how it was created, who it was created by, how, you know, it's gone through the decades and how we've got to where we are today with meth use, or, well, today, the mid-2000s when this book was written and said. And it also talked a lot about meth trafficking from Mexico into the US and how that affected meth use in America. And it wasn't really what I got into this book for. Like, some of that information, I think, was very helpful for context, just to understand, you know, the larger picture outside of just this one town. But I think there was too much of it. I honestly was kind of bored by it. I'm sure there was good information in it, but it kind of walked the middle ground where it was too much of it to hold my information in this book, like too much information about the history and the Mexican drug trade, but also not enough that it was really a deep dive into those things. It was more like a general overview of all of that. It just wasn't detailed or insightful enough to add anything, and because it wasn't what I was here for, I found it pretty dull, and to be honest, it was a struggle not to skim those sections. One thing I really enjoyed was his writing style. He has this wonderful journalistic writing style. It feels like a news article, like it feels the way news articles are written. He creates this distance from the reader, which works really well when he was writing about Olwine, when he was turning Olwine, or attempting to turn it into, like, the main character of the story, to write about this town and its people and how the community comes together to do things. Like, his writing style complemented that so well. It was so beautiful. Like, it was honestly, like, one of my favorite styles. Like, just the combination of the narrative he was telling with his writing style, I thought was really wonderful. Like, that was fantastic for me. I really liked learning about the town and the townspeople and kind of how things were going badly for the town. It was a small rural community. Farming got harder because of big agriculture. When factories closed up and left town, it left a lot of people without jobs. So you can see kind of this town spiraling downwards and what they're doing to try to work back up from that, and how meth played into all of that, and how meth was both a cause and effect of some things. And it was really interesting to learn that. Like, I wish that had been the main focus of the book. I wish that had been like 85 to 90% of the book, because it felt like so much more of the book was about the history of meth and the drug trade and all this biographical information about a few people in the town, when what I wanted was more of the town. I feel like had he focused on that, I would have really loved this book a lot more. My last negative point, unfortunately, was kind of just a fact-checking issue. In the afterword at the very end of the book, he talks about how in the first edition there were a number of minor factual errors. I did not read the first edition, so those were corrected for my book. I didn't experience that, but he did talk about it, and he talked about how some people had an issue with it, and he, you know, full on called it inexcusable, and that was his problem. And it was very basic things. Like, one of the examples he gave, because again, I didn't get it in my copy, he at one point called Iowa City the biggest city in Iowa, which is not true. Des Moines would be the most populated. And he just discussed that and was like, yeah, like, I got that wrong. People called me on it. I corrected it in later editions, which sure, but for me, it kind of brings up a bigger issue of like, if you have these factual errors, if you have these very basic things that you're getting wrong, that you haven't been able to correct, it's like, how can I trust you with the rest of the book? Like, there's so much in this book that I found very interesting, that was interesting information. And then after reading that, it's like, well, you know, if he couldn't get the very basic Googleable stuff correct, that like other people who had this very basic information corrected him, how can I trust him to get the stuff that isn't easily Googleable, that other people can't, you know, fact check for him? Like when he's talking about these people and telling their stories, it's like, how do I know he didn't get some of those facts incorrect? And like, obviously you can't really fact check that as an outsider. And it creates this level of mistrust where it's like, I don't know how much I got from this book and how much I'm questioning him as a writer, that he couldn't even fact check the most basic of information, like to find out what the most populated city in Iowa is. He got that wrong in a book that he published with a traditional publishing company. It creates a lot of questions and issues for me. And I know he corrected it in my edition, but even then, it got all the way to publication with what he kind of implied was a number of factual errors. Overall, I didn't think this was a bad book. I did enjoy it. I enjoyed a lot learning about the town. I liked learning about the people, and I really liked seeing what the town did, what the mayor of the town did to improve life in the town, to try to court call centers into coming and setting up business in the town, to bring in more jobs, to court like new factories, to building a new sewer system. Like, all that information was really interesting to me. And when he was talking about how meth had affected the town, how it had affected the school and the lives of children in the town and the lives of adults, like, that was really interesting to me. And that was the heart of the book, but unfortunately, there wasn't enough of it for me. It just wasn't as insightful or as detailed as I would have wanted, and unfortunately, I didn't get that much out of it, but I still think it was worth the read. And I think if you're specifically interested in this topic, and if you like a very journalistic style, I would recommend it, but I would say maybe temper your expectations a bit. It wasn't a favorite for me, but I am glad I got to it. I did learn some stuff from it, and I think it was very interesting to hear about old wine. Let me know down below if you've read Methland and what you thought of it if you have. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.